Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Shakuntala Santhavan, Shax for short. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Vital Talks Live, presenting the premiere of the film Tobacco Slave. The film is by the Tobacco Control Research Group at the University of Bath as part of its work with the tobacco industry watchdog, STOP. So historically, the tobacco industry is closely linked with slavery. The slave trade has been abolished, but unknown to many, in this day and age, some of the world's biggest tobacco companies are benefiting from farming practices so exploitative the farmers call themselves tobacco slaves. While these companies are profiting, benefiting, billions in profit, the farmers are growing debts. So it's not just smoking tobacco that's harmful. The harm is at every stage, beginning with the farmers. It is time to confront this modern day exploitation. And to help us do that, we have with us this evening the film's director, Roy Maconachie. He will share with us his personal experience speaking with tobacco farmers. Also with us is Noy Thrupkaew. Noy is the director of Ida B. Wells' fellowship program and also reporting fellow at Type Investigations, which is a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to transforming the field of independent investigative journalism. Noy is also a TED Talk speaker. She's investigated some of the biggest human trafficking cases in the United States. And she's also explored ways to increase accountability in law enforcement initiatives against forced prostitution. Right, through their work, they're helping shine a light, bring exploitative labor out of the shadows and into the public eye, helping protect more people. We are honored to have them here with us this evening for what I'm sure will be a very illuminating evening. Right, without further ado, we present Tobacco Slave. Thank you both for taking the time to be here with us this evening. Roy, first, congratulations on the film which you directed. What inspired the film? How did it come about?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks very much for the invitation to be here. This is actually the first public screening we've had of the film. So it's been a labor of love for the last almost 2 years now. So this is the first time anyone's really releasing it publicly. So I'm a professor of natural resources and development at the University of Bath in the UK, which is located right next to Bristol, which we've already seen a little bit of the history of Bristol in the film. But my background was actually, before I became an academic, I was a documentary photographer. So visual storytelling has always been an important part of my work. It's been a great way to be able to share my academic work with a much wider audience. But I guess the initial premise of the film came from the Tobacco Control Research Group, which is a group of activists and scholars at the University of Bath who are working around tobacco issues with Vital, with STOP. And it was about around the time of, it was just after actually the killing of George Floyd, with the Black Lives Matter really picking up. And the city of Bristol is a very politically engaged city, and there was a lot of interest in looking at the history of slavery of the city and its links to tobacco. So the film came from that initial idea of exploring and uncovering some of those legacies of slavery and tobacco in Bristol, and then working outwards and looking at how those legacies are perpetuated in contemporary tobacco growing. And we chose Malawi as the country of focus.
So we saw the farmers toiling from dawn till dusk, backbreaking labor. They're exposed to tobacco-related illness, and they remain stuck in poverty. Some might say that they have a choice to choose to grow something else. Why did they even get involved with these tobacco companies? What did the farmers tell you, Roy?
I mean, this story is, you see it in so many different commodities being produced in Africa. So I'll be honest, tobacco is a new area for me, But my area of expertise is in labor exploitation around natural resources. So I do a lot of work in small-scale mining. I've worked in cocoa production, looking at cocoa production in Ghana, cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We all have mobile phones and laptops and are moving towards electric cars. So this is becoming something that a lot of people are much more aware of now. But we see these same sort of stories where companies are at the top, that sort of the tree at the top of exploitation, and it's those producing the goods at the bottom of the chain that are susceptible to this kind of exploitation. So it didn't really surprise me that the same things were being replicated in the tobacco sector. We see it elsewhere. And I think the thing that surprised me really was the fact that it's so organized in the tobacco sector. So we see formal contracts where, as you saw in the film, growers get trapped in these forms of indentured labor and they can't break out. Whereas in other sectors I've looked at, the relationships have been much more informal. But the idea of farmers diversifying away from tobacco, I think, although we can all see that would be a positive development, it's really not as easy, I think, as just stopping to grow tobacco.
Can you explain why it would be so difficult for them to do that?
They get into debt and they can't get out of debt, and there aren't really a lot of other options. I mean, Malawi is an agricultural country. They've been growing, as you saw in the film, they've been dependent on tobacco for many years. They'll get into a contract with a leaf buying company and they'll take loans for things like fertilizer and seed. And they can't pay the loan off, or they get to a point where the companies won't actually buy more of the leaf from them if they overproduce, because they want to keep them in that sort of that state of servitude. So it's really shocking that it happens, but you really feel for these farmers, because a lot of the time they're struggling and they're working in these conditions because they want a better life for their families, for their children, which a lot of us can relate to who have families, and it's a very, very disturbing situation, I think.
So we saw in the film that UN 2022 report on tobacco farming in Malawi that highlighted serious concerns about trafficking and forced labor, including by children. Thousands of cases reported, likely many more that go unreported. Noy, you've been investigating, researching human trafficking and labor exploitation since 2006. And this kind of exploitation isn't just in farming, is it?
Absolutely, Shax. You can see it in everything from domestic work, agricultural work, construction, fishing, shrimping, hair braiding salons, car washes. I mean, it's really quite a wide variety of industries that it can appear in. And I think one commonality is that whenever there is a lack of regulation or a tight monopoly on kind of sales and labor, then these kinds of things and like human trafficking can't exist. So it's any place where there's been a degraded labor market and a lack of regulation, these kinds of things can occur.
And it isn't happening in just some far-flung place. It's here, right here, in this city, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely. It's when I talk about human trafficking, sometimes people say, I can't believe that's happening here. I can't believe it's happening now. And it's because of that cognitive dissonance that we feel that surely this is not a practice that would be happening now and would be happening here. But that's because the supply chains and labor transparency is not something that we're privy to. And in fact, that is knowledge that is deliberately being concealed from us. So I do not fault any of us for not knowing that this happens, because it is being hidden from us and because it has been kind of put at a distance from our lives on purpose.
I think it was put very nicely by Richard Stone, the historian in the film, who did talk about that cognitive dissonance or that disconnect, the fact that these supply chains are so complex a lot of the time that we're just really not aware. These problems are hidden or invisible.
Hidden in plain sight, really.
In plain sight. Until you go to a place like Malawi and you talk to people at the bottom of the chain and you really understand the conditions that they are subjected to.
So this is a systemic problem. It's not localized. It's really very wide-ranging. What did you learn, Roy, in Malawi about what keeps this power dynamic in place, where the farmers have little or no bargaining power. They're not naive. They know they're being taken advantage of, but they can't do much to change it.
They do know, and I think it's that contract that they get into, which we saw them talking about, where they can't break out, which is the really big challenge for them right now. Governments, I think, are aware of what's going on, but I would say that governments have to do more to support the farmers, to help them diversify away from this destructive crop, tobacco. Governments often pay subsidies to the companies, and it perpetuates this. Why is this happening?
Why pay subsidies to tobacco companies when we're trying to get people to quit smoking?
Governments in African countries are often desperate for foreign direct investment. These are poor countries. They're often dependent on a single commodity. The companies often wield more power than the country itself, particularly in the work I've been doing with some of the big mining companies. So the government will often bend over backwards to create these conditions where companies can't, the investment is just so easy and so lucrative that they almost can't say no. So things like giving companies tax holidays, having very low wages amongst the local population, lax environmental standards. All of these things make it easier for companies to profit because they can sort of shirk away these external negative externalities, I think they're called by economists. But that's the real cost of the goods that we're buying, and they're not being factored in.
Noy, do you see common threads between the experience of the tobacco farmers in Malawi and people you've worked with, engaged with in other labor sectors?
Absolutely. There's this loan structure that can become very coercive and usurious. Sometimes people are desperate to leave their home countries. They want to work in the United States or other more wealthy countries, so they accept a loan for their migratory process or for their visa process. Then that loan is deducted from their salary, or it's used as a way to kind of continue to coerce their labor because the loan will be collected from their families, right? So there's this kind of control over the migratory process or fertilizer, the things that you need to actually do your job. There's a monopoly on that's used to control your own financial input and output. So definitely have seen things like that.
The structure of the middleman?
Yes, the middleman structure. Actually, thank you so much, Shax. So basically, these companies are evading responsibility by saying, oh, they're just contractors. We're not a direct employer of this person, therefore our liability for the welfare of this person, our duty of care is not something that we really need to touch. I was really struck by the way in which the English-speaking farmer said he had tenants and he was unable to pay them. So in effect, this company was enforcing him to inadvertently indenture other workers.
Two tiers of
Two tiers, right? So they were just passing on the sin and the guilt of what they were doing onto a party who did not have any control or any desire to do this to his 10 tenants.
And just coming back to that point you made about the sort of the broker in the middle, the intermediary. I mean, we see that very clearly with some of the leaf buying companies in Malawi, so that the larger big tobacco companies can sort of hold it at an arm's length and say, well, we're not directly supporting these conditions. We just buy the tobacco from the local, buyer. So I think it's very clever the way that they do this.
It creates plausible deniability.
It does.
And so there's always a legal loophole. There's always some other person. There's a contractor sometimes and then a subcontractor. And then after that, and actually tracing the chain of responsibility is deliberately made so difficult.
Now, many of the people in these desperate situations have no avenue to be heard. Your work is helping shine a light on these desperate, appalling situations. And you were telling us, Roy, about the films you've made, right? We've got Tobacco Slave. You made one on diamond mining in Sierra Leone, the cocoa trade in Ghana, and also cobalt miners, right? So why do you make these films? What do you hope to accomplish with them?
Well, for a start, I guess the visual storytelling comes quite natural to me. I mentioned I started off as a documentary photographer. I started doing more work that was concerned with development issues. I decided to go back to university. I ended up doing a master's and a PhD, and I call myself an accidental academic because I made one decision and it took me down a very different path. But the camera is still important to me in my work, and I use the camera, one, because I think it's a very powerful way of allowing people to tell their stories on their own terms and represent themselves. In international development work, where I situate my own research, there's a big discussion now about decolonizing knowledge and allowing people, particularly in the global south, to tell stories on their own terms rather than people like me coming in and saying, this is how it is. So the film as a medium is a very powerful way of allowing people to tell those stories, but it's also a great way, I think, to disseminate the stories to a much wider audience beyond academia.
Than a research paper.
Than a research paper. I mean, the number of people who read my papers is a very small group. It's a small community. I can come to New York and share what I do with a film where I translate that work into something that's interesting to policymakers, to government, to the general public who are concerned, and to challenge these companies. I mean, that's the ultimate aim, is to put pressure.
We're going to look at that pressure right after this, because you've actually had tangible results, certainly with the diamond mining film, right?
Yeah, so a few years ago, we did a film looking at artisanal diamond mining in Sierra Leone, looking at exploitation. The same kinds of relationships exist, but in a more formal tributor-supporter kind of relationship than these formal contracts. But we traced artisanal diamonds from the pit in Sierra Leone through to Antwerp, where the rough stones are cut and polished. And the film has had a lot of impacts in terms of, I've shared it with policymakers and government in Sierra Leone, and that work has actually informed the development of a new artisanal mining policy, which takes into account some of these issues and conditions. So my role, I play a very small role in this, but if I can help to inform through my research and share with people who pull those levers of power and can make that change, then I feel proud that the work is actually doing something rather than just informing journal articles.
Very worthy work, if I may say so. Noy, you don't consider yourself a storyteller, do you? How would you describe what you do?
Yeah, I do investigative journalism, so I do employ narrative forms to try and talk about the investigative findings that I am able to uncover. But I am somewhat wary of the ways in which power is deployed in curatorial choices that in storytelling that is sometimes obscured by just a good yarn. So I feel a little uncomfortable sometimes talking about my work as being that of telling a story, because what I feel I'm trying to do is to understand harms that are happening to marginalized communities. And I feel so many underrepresented communities tell us that they're experiencing harm, but they're not believed. So my work is to quantify, to do the kind of objective, quote unquote, objective data work, right? So investigative journalism is thought of as being fairly scientific and objective, which again, are not terms that I entirely feel comfortable with using myself, but it's a way of amassing the power of an investigation to support the claims and allegations that are made by marginalized people. And Shax was asking me before, isn't this a bit grim sometimes, this work of researching these kinds of forms of exploitation? And it absolutely can be, because we are talking about the harms that permeate people's entire lives, where they live, the green tobacco sickness, like the fate of their children. It is a public health issue. It is a life issue, your working conditions and your working circumstances. But my work is very much informed by the activism and the organizing of workers who themselves are experiencing this. But not only, a story is not just found, it's constructed. They're able to not only experience this, but analyze the circumstances and the social conditions of their work. And they tell me, and I'm able to kind of do further research and amplify what they have themselves been telling us all this time.
So we saw what Imperial Brands had to say about the film. They deny the allegations vigorously. They say that they do care about the welfare of the farmers, that they want to help alleviate poverty, which is not the experience of the farmers, certainly that we saw there in Malawi. So what would it take to get companies like Imperial Brands to change their business practices? How do we hold them to account, Roy?
Well, I think, for a lot of the things that we consume, I think the consumer has a tremendous amount of power in terms of pushing back, in terms of asking questions about where things are being produced and how. Tobacco is maybe a slightly different commodity, but certainly with the work I've been doing on cobalt, cobalt is obviously, as everyone knows here, a key ingredient in lithium-ion batteries. So we've got, pointing the finger at certain aspects of the supply chain. We've got companies now like Tesla, like Apple, these big companies now that are concerned about their supply chains. So I think that's quite important, I would say.
Noy, how do we hold these companies to account?
Right. I mean, sometimes people get a little bit overwhelmed when they learn about these things, but I'm very happy to say there's almost always some form of worker organizing or activist campaigns, educational campaigns like the ones that are launched here and held here at Vital Strategies. And so I think companies are very afraid of their reputational risk, right? And so consumer awareness is a fundamental part of that, but you cannot buy your way out of a capitalist problem. That is the problem of consumer activism sometimes, if it's divorced from larger communal and strategic campaigns and worker organizing. So I always say, please look for the organizations doing extraordinary work. Look for the workers who are themselves, upholding their rights and struggling to make things better for themselves and their communities. And that's where we can lend our greatest pressure and support.
So the onus is on the corporation and not the individual. Aren't we all complicit to some extent, though, with the products that we consume, services we use that might use exploitative labor?
I would say that we need champions at all along the supply chain at maybe different scales and different levels. So it's a question of, hearing the stories of these brave farmers at the very bottom. It's a question of putting pressure on governments to create better conditions and lobby. It's a question of getting organizations like the UN and the World Health Organization involved, who can really put pressure on policy. And at the top as well, I think, as I said, I think we're all implicated in buying these commodities. So we do hold some power there. And I think it's really a question of getting engagement in all these different areas.
Mm-hmm. So the role of government. Noy, in your TED Talk, you pointed out that the criminal justice system is often more of a problem than a part of the solution. How so?
Yeah, I was asking Roy before if I've seen a pattern sometimes in labor exploitation cases where unscrupulous employers will actually call law enforcement to try and put down worker organizing, particularly if those workers are criminalized in any way, aka if they are undocumented or if they have fallen out of status. So there have been multiple instances, and actually you can trace it back, speaking of historical resonances, with the formation of slave patrols, right? So this is a very consistent use of law enforcement and so-called criminal justice to put down the rights of workers in favor of exploitative slave owners or employers or people who are benefiting from the exploitation of their labor. So I find that deeply problematic. Roy spoke about the ways that governments are giving subsidies. Maybe they are also refusing to look at the environmental costs, the exploitative labor costs. They are deliberately not enforcing certain protections that these workers and farmers should be receiving. And that is a huge problem with a free market that has actually been tailored to give advantages and supports to employers and buyers rather than workers and farmers.
I think the elephant in the room, certainly in the African context, is also that many governments have vested interests in maintaining these kinds of informal exploitation. Mm-hmm. Revenue mismanagement and corruption is something that we have to deal with, and it's not all of the problem, but it is possibly a reason why, in some cases, there's resistance to positive change.
Mm-hmm.
So Tobacco Slave is going to be shown in Bristol next month. It'll be interesting to see how it's received there, right, where Imperial Brands is headquartered, and also conversations going on about reckoning with that past with slavery, right?
Yeah, so the woman you saw in the film, Asher Craig, the deputy mayor of Bristol, has been very active in terms of engaging with the colonial past of Bristol, with discussions about reparation, about dealing with the past, and it's been fantastic having her involved. She'll be chairing the screening, so they're very actively involved. Bristol is a very politically charged city with lots of activism, so I'm really excited to see the sort of reaction we get in Bristol itself. Next week is the screening, actually. Yeah.
Let's get some questions now from our lovely audience. If you have a question for Roy or Noy, please raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. Anybody got a question?
Thank you. Rebecca from Tobacco Free Portfolios. I had a question about, you had mentioned that BAT, PMI, and Imperial were all buying tobacco from these farmers in Malawi. Do you have any idea what sort of percentage of tobacco, of their tobacco that they're purchasing is coming from Malawi, like by company? Do you have sort of an idea there?
I don't have those figures to hand, and it's a good question. It would be interesting to know. My sense is that it's quite a significant amount. Mm-hmm. Malawi is one of the largest tobacco producers in Africa, but they would be buying from other countries as well. You possibly would know more about those figures than I do, because as I said, I'm certainly not an expert in the field of tobacco. Mm-hmm. But I was just concerned about the way that this exploitation was really happening, and that that's where I was coming from with this film, was engaging with these buyers and the conditions that they really are susceptible to.
Mm. I wonder if there's a way to figure that out by looking at bills of lading. So when people import goods, there is a document generated called a bill of lading, and you can use a database called Panjiva to look at where that shipment originated and who is the receiver. But that might be a bit tricky because the receiver might not put themselves down as Imperial, right? You'd have to figure out who the receiver is, but that's a fantastic question, and I'm dying to know myself. That's maybe where I might start. I don't know. I'm thinking I might start there or something, but I would love to chat with you more about how one would figure that out.
Any more questions? Anyone else with a question? The gentleman here. Oh.
Hi. I really liked this. It was really interesting. I know you said that as an academic, a lot of people don't read your work, which I understand. I have something of an academic background, but I was really interested in the longer history of tobacco and Bristol. And, for instance, I really love the book Empire of Cotton by Sven Becker, and I was just wondering if you had any recommendations for texts on that history.
I don't actually off the top of my head. I know there's been lots written. At the University of Bristol, there's a lot going on. Richard Stone has written quite a few papers on it. We've got there's academics who are also working in Liverpool, which is another point of one of the big slaving ports in the UK. It's really, I think, an area that there's been a lot more interest in recently, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement. There's been a lot of engagement in terms of looking back and trying to understand how we got to where we are and making those links between slavery, between racism, between current day exploitation. Maybe we can exchange contact details afterwards, and I certainly can get back to you with some suggestions. But thank you for asking that.
You had a question as well?
Yeah, I was curious about the parallel you drew between the diamond industry, which has taken this tremendous slide, partly because of the reputational damage of blood diamonds, and like the tobacco industry, there's relatively few multinational diamonds, so that maybe there's almost an opportunity there. It's not like fashion where there's thousands of brands, and
yeah.
I don't know. So what can we learn by the slide of diamonds and the reputational damage? in that industry that we might take up in the tobacco world?
Yeah, no, I mean, I see certain parallel themes, but you're right, they are very different commodities. So, one of the things about when we're looking at minerals is that companies come to a country because those mineral deposits are there and they're fixed and they can't be moved. Somewhere like Malawi, where they're growing a crop that could potentially be grown in other countries, companies can have a lot of power over the government, over farmers by saying, look, Zimbabwe is a tobacco growing country right next door. We can go there and we can grow there unless you sort of live up to these conditions and give us some good conditions to where we can make that investment. The conflict thing is something a little bit different, I think, as well. But yeah, I mean, mining, there's definitely parallels that we can learn from those levels of exploitation that happen with big investments. And these companies they're responsible to their shareholders, right? They're not there. They'll tell you we're not here to develop this country. They have to engage with local communities in a way where the labor can be productive. But beyond that, as long as they're following the laws, which often are not very good laws, they can say we're doing no wrong.
One more question.
Hi. Firstly, incredible film. I think it's such an amazing medium to be able to show these kind of atrocities and what is happening, especially outside of the walls of whatever country or border that you're in. I guess my question is more in terms of, for both of you, accessibility to this information, and in wanting to use a medium like film or investigative journalism, like what does that look like to be able to get access, to be able to have these people trust you, to say these things when there is really big consequences that neither of you have control over once you guys leave. And so in terms of being able to use the mediums that you use in order to get these stories across, like what is the access point that you guys use and the methods in terms of to be able to talk to ministries of health, to these governments, to these larger companies, and then to the people themselves? Like how does that differ in your methods of being able to get access to the truth, essentially?
Do you want to start, Noy?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand the question. So it's basically, how do we try and do what we do in terms of talking to all kinds of different people?
Right, and the access to the actual truth of what is at the core of the issue, and getting these different, who have completely opposing,
Yes.
takeaways and wants.
Right. So basically, how do we figure out what's actually going on?
Yeah.
Because we're hearing multiple competing narratives.
Yes.
Oh man, that's a great question. It's like a super long process. I mean, at least for me, I'm like not the fastest in the whole world, but I mean, investigative journalism. You start with a hypothesis, right? So you hear, farmers in Malawi are saying we are being harmed by this particular practice. And then in terms of the work that I do, I look for documentation. So I look for things like we were talking about, like the bills of lading. What is the paper trail? If there is any, right, that's a problem. If there is any about this kind of particularly exploitative process and practice, then you triangulate, you try to talk to many different farmers who sometimes you snowball, you talk to people who are referring you to each other, but you have to go outside of that and conduct develop a kind of solid sample in terms of talking to different farmers. Then you also have to try and cultivate sources on the inside of those industries. If you can get somebody to give you documents pertaining to what we've seen here, that's also very valuable. And I use Freedom of Information Act requests to try and get government information as well in terms of how much of this practice is actually happening. Using the research that was kind of mentioned in here, I would ask them methodological questions. How did you conduct your surveys and your research? And then kind of go from there and replicate some of that. So it's a very long process of trying to figure out what's actually happening.
When the truth is being concealed.
Absolutely. So it is really, really difficult. You basically are like, it's a whodunit, right? You're like, what is the slime trail that I'm trying to follow here? And it can be quite difficult. When I write drafts, I have to footnote every single claim that I'm making. Right. To make sure, number one, I give the investigative target, like one of these tobacco companies, the right to respond, but also it has to pass muster through our fact check process to make sure I'm not saying anything incorrect. So it's a very long team kind of process that intimately involve sources like these farmers, but hopefully also insiders and other forms of documentation and data.
Roy?
And for me, I'm coming back to this idea of trust and getting people to open up. I mean, for me, I basically collect primary data, so I'm not using other people's research or data necessarily. I'm actually engaging with people, hearing their stories, and getting them to open up, particularly in situations where there's illicit activities going on or exploitation is not easy. I work with local universities in Africa. I often work with a fixer who can serve as a gatekeeper to open up opportunities. But I also have been going, not with tobacco, but I've been with some of the other areas I've been working on in West Africa. I've been, I've been going to the same community for many years. So I started working in Sierra Leone in 2003, looking at post-conflict reconstruction in diamond mining areas. And I go back to the same village every time I go back. I stay in the same house. Everyone knows me. So that relationship of trust, I think, is something that only you can build over time. Just sort of parachuting in and asking all kinds of invasive questions. People are just going to tell you, I'm not going to answer your question, I'm sorry. And then getting engagement from companies is another issue altogether, and that's often challenging. I've been lucky in the work I've done with the work on diamond and gold mining and getting that engagement, but we didn't have much luck other than the response from Imperial at the end and getting any kind of comment from the big tobacco companies. But surprise, surprise, I wonder why they... Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
That statement at the end, for me, is absurd. And it just lends more power to the film, really.
There's so much more to talk about, but we do have to wrap up our conversation. What is your final takeaway for our audience? How can we all help take action to keep what we've heard today at the forefront of people's hearts and minds? Roy, do you want to go first?
I mean, as I said, my own personal role is a small one. It's about hearing the stories and trying to translate them to share with the wider public. I think we all need to be politically engaged. We need to question where these things that we're consuming are coming from. We need to know, we need to be inquisitive about, the conditions, about the pay. We need to write your local politician. We need to put the spotlight on these companies who are getting away with these, really upsetting conditions and this exploitation. So I think we all have a role to play in terms of that.
Noy?
Yeah, I think it's so wonderful that you all are here in the first place. I mean, this is an investment of your time and your caring and your attention, and that is something that our time is not it's a non-renewable resource. So the fact that you are here is already amazing. But there are, kind of groups that are working actively on human trafficking and labor exploitation issues here in this country. There's obviously a case happening to support the workers here in Malawi, and there's all the kind of organizing and activism that's happening around tobacco campaigns already that have made this film even possible. So I think there is an amazing groundswell of work already existent that one can kind of tap into and lend support to.
Thank you both for your vital insights, your perspective, and your commitment to helping make the world healthier and more equitable. Let's now welcome Jorge Alday, who is the director of STOP, to give us his closing thoughts.
Thank you, Shax, Noy, and Roy for joining us this evening. I'd also like to extend my thanks to our colleagues at the University of Bath for a tremendous collaboration, and everyone here at Vital Strategies for hosting this screening. I've been working to reduce the impact of tobacco use for over 15 years, and at a rate of 8 million people dying from tobacco every year. That's 120 million people that have died from tobacco use since I started this work. And there are a lot of people that have been doing this work for a lot longer than I've been doing it. The main driver for those deaths is the tobacco industry. And one of the things that I've learned along the way is that the tobacco industry doesn't just harm the consumer. As we see from the film, from crushing debt to working atrocious safety standards, tobacco farmers are at the beginning of a very long, complex, global supply chain of harm. Increasingly, that supply chain starts in Africa. From 2005 to 2020, the tobacco growing globally decreased by 4.3%. In that same time period in Africa, it increased by almost 36%. So it is moving to Africa. At the other end, at the top of the tree of exploitation, are corporations like Imperial Tobacco, Philip Morris International, British American Tobacco that are printing money, making cigarettes, hundreds of billions of cigarettes every year. Just last week, Philip Morris announced third quarter net revenues of $9.1 billion in one quarter. That's one company. These inequities run deep because they're produced by systems that were created hundreds of years ago to extract wealth from the global south to the global north. They cannot be dismantled quickly, but there are at least three things, of the many things we've already talked about, that we can do to help start chipping away at these systems. First, we can help farmers quit tobacco. Over the past 3 growing seasons, more than 2,000 farmers in Kenya have transitioned to high iron beans as part of a joint United Nations initiative called Tobacco Free Farms that is part or includes the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Because as another harmful aspect of tobacco, it also destroys our planet. The program is expected to expand further in Kenya, as we saw in Zambia, and into Tanzania, but there is a long way to go. Second, governments in tobacco-growing countries can stop effectively subsidizing wealthy tobacco companies and use that money to help farmers transition to other crops, growing food. Third, we can help farmers find legal paths to justice. We mentioned it a bit in the film, but in the UK, there's a lawsuit that's been filed on behalf of thousands of Malawian farmers alleging to Imperial Brands and British American Tobacco that they have participated in this exploitation and that they've profited essentially from child labor. All of these potential solutions will take time, money, and a commitment to change, but precisely because that path is long, it's indirect, and it's uneven, we have to keep reminding ourselves that it is a path worth being on. And that's what stories like Tobacco Slave, I think, can help us do. So it's our role as part of the industry watchdog stop to monitor, investigate, and bring those stories to those who have the power to hold industry accountable. Together, and thanks to the work of people like Roy and investigative journalists like Noy, we can counter that misinformation, that narrative that we're hearing from companies who would love more than anything for us to think that this is not what's happening. So Tobacco Slave will start streaming tomorrow at exposedtobacco.org. Please come to the website. Follow us on social media at Exposed Tobacco. Let's continue the conversation in this room. We're going to have a great conversation in Bristol, hopefully also in Nairobi, and some other cities in potentially Latin America, Europe, and in Africa. So thanks very much.